The heat in Prairie View is heavy and sticky, like an old blanket covering the town from dawn to dusk. Dusty roads, scorched by the sun, wind between single-story houses with peeling paint, whose yards are overgrown with tall, dry grass. There is no bustle of big cities here, only the slow rhythm of life, the steady clopping of boots on wooden porches, the occasional car lazily passing through the main street, and the hollow chimes of the church bell, reminding of eternity. Prairie View was one of those towns that seemed frozen in time. Here people knew each other for generations, and strangers rarely stayed for long. When someone arrived, they were looked at with curiosity, but also with a slight suspicion. They were used to constancy. However, in recent years, the town felt a strange emptiness. It seemed that even the walls of the old Grace of God church, standing in the center of the town, were tired of waiting for change. And then, change came. Ron Addison arrived in Prairie View in early August when the heat was particularly unbearable. He appeared without fanfare, without grand announcements, without articles in the local newspaper. One morning, a few parishioners saw him on the steps of the church. Of average height, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held a mix of kindness and hidden burden, he looked like a man carrying the weight of invisible worries. In his dark shirt with a narrow collar and black pants, he immediately fit into the conservative atmosphere of the town. His first sermons astonished the listeners. Ron's voice was steady and deep, but there was an elusive note in it, as if behind the words of love, hope, and forgiveness, there was a pain that he would never speak aloud. He spoke as if he wasn't just reading lines from Scripture, but as if he had gone through the trials himself and was now sharing that experience. The congregation listened, holding their breath. People who had heard the same speeches from the previous pastor for years suddenly felt something new. The youth who had previously avoided the church began to appear at services. Even the elderly, who were used to everything, whispered after the sermons, discussing the new pastor and his amazing ability to touch the very heart. But despite his openness, Ron remained a mystery. Much was said about him, but little was known. When asked about his origins, he answered evasively, "I traveled looking for my place." It sounded plausible, as many pastors indeed wandered through different parishes. But the old-timers who had lived in Prairie View all their lives began to notice oddities. He never mentioned his family. No one heard him talk about his parents, siblings, or childhood. Some women, gathering after the service in a small cafe on the corner, shared their observations. For a man over 40, he is too lonely. Isn't that strange? But what if he was unhappy in the past? Maybe God led him here to find a new path. Or on the contrary, to hide something? Conversations died down when someone unfamiliar entered the cafe. People in Prairie View knew how to keep secrets, their own and others. However the town might have speculated, the new pastor was welcomed with joy. After long years of stagnation, after the weariness of the previous servant who left due to heart disease, the church found a fresh breath of air. People were drawn to Ron, to his words, to his attentiveness. He found time for everyone. He could help an elderly woman carry her groceries, stop on the street to chat with children, help young mothers who came to the church seeking support. He didn't just preach, he lived among his parishioners. But even amidst all this bright renewal, there was something invisible in the air, like a shadow flickering in the corner of one's eye. Some felt it more strongly than others. No matter how kind his smile was, no matter how sincere his words were, a fleeting glimmer of worry sometimes flashed in his eyes. Perhaps everyone has ghosts from their past, but in Ron Addison's case, his past could be much darker than anyone could imagine. In Prairie View, there lived a woman named Loretta Hayes. She was around 50 and was one of those called pillars of the community in small towns. She had lived in this town all her life, knew everyone, and despite her kind nature, she had one important talent. She could sense lies. Loretta was not wealthy, but she possessed the priceless gift of empathy. She cared for the elderly, helped in the church kitchen, and organized charity drives. If trouble struck the town, everyone knew. Loretta would be the first to come to the rescue. She met Pastor Ron shortly after his arrival. Their first interaction was light, even warm. He smiled at her, helped organize events, and showed in every way that he valued her contribution to the community. But something about him made her uneasy. Every time she tried to learn about his past, not directly but delicately, within the framework of a friendly conversation, he either changed the subject or gave carefully crafted answers. "I served in different places," he would say. "I was in Arkansas, a little in Louisiana, but I always knew that God was leading me to Texas." She nodded, but inside her, the feeling that he was telling half-truths never left. As a person who first and foremost served the truth, how could he so easily avoid specifics? Prairie View was a small town, but with a good memory. Every new resident sparked natural interest. At first, people just watched. Then they started asking questions. Someone asked, "What happened to his family? Why does he never talk about his parents? Which church committee sent him here?" At first, these questions were pure curiosity, but the more Ron evaded answers, the more speculation arose among the people. However, no one dared to ask directly. No one except Loretta. One Sunday after the service, when the parishioners had dispersed, she invited him for a cup of tea in the small cafe on the corner. "I think you're a great pastor," she began, wrapping her hands around a cup of hot tea. Ron smiled. "Thank you, Loretta. I try my best. But you know, people like to know where their pastor came from." She didn't speak accusingly, just observed his reaction. Ron froze for a second but quickly regained his composure. "I understand," he said softly, "but sometimes the past stays in the past for good reasons." She noticed how his fingers tightened around the spoon. "Isn't it said in the scriptures that the truth should always be revealed?" she asked, watching him. In response, he only smiled and took a sip of coffee. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than lies, Loretta." That was the first warning. Despite his evasive answers, Loretta couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. She began to ask people what they knew about him. The documents about his appointment came without seals. "Strange, isn't it?" one of the church council members told her. "No one has ever heard of his previous parishes. He says he traveled, but we have no records of his service," noted the church accountant. "He never tells stories from his childhood, as if he didn't have one," added an elderly parishioner. These details meant nothing on their own, but together they painted a troubling picture. Loretta was not the only one who noticed. Evan Miller, the pastor's young assistant, a man with a sharp mind and sincere faith, also began to see inconsistencies. "He's too cautious," he once told Loretta, "as if he's afraid his secrets will surface." Everything changed one night. Loretta lived not far from the church. Late one evening, as she was about to go to bed, she was awakened by the sound of voices from the street. Opening the window slightly, she saw a dark figure standing on the church porch. In the light of the street lamp, she recognized Ron. He was talking on the phone. His voice was muffled but tense. "I told you not to call here," he snapped. Loretta couldn't make out the response, but the tone of his voice made her freeze. "No," he said a moment later. "Stay away from this town. Do you understand me?" There was a pause, then she heard him exhale through clenched teeth. "If you show up, I'll do what I should have done long ago." Loretta recoiled. She didn't know who he was talking to. But one thing was clear. Someone knew the truth, and the pastor was afraid of it. From that evening when Loretta overheard the pastor's troubling phone conversation, her sense of danger only intensified. She was not a woman prone to dramatization, but her intuition rarely failed her. And this time, her inner voice was screaming at her. He is hiding something. However, it wasn't just her who began to notice strange things in Ron's behavior. Evan Miller, the young pastor's assistant, trusted by many parishioners, also felt that something was changing in his mentor's demeanor. Previously, Ron seemed open and kind, genuinely caring for his flock. But now he was becoming irritable, sharp, especially when someone asked about his past. Recently, after the service, one of the parishioners asked him where he studied to become a pastor. Evan once told Loretta. He just smiled and replied, "In different places." When she asked for clarification, he said, "What difference does it make where you studied? The important thing is how you serve the Lord." Loretta frowned. "Did you see how he reacted?" He clenched his fists, as if he wanted to say something but held back. This was troubling. But what worried her even more was the appearance of a stranger in town. Small towns have their own rules. Here, strangers always attract attention, especially if they act like they have something to hide. At first, Loretta didn't pay much attention to the man who sat in the corner of the local cafe for several days, ordering only black coffee and barely talking to people. But on the third day, something caught her attention. When Ron left the church, this man followed him with his gaze, slowly sipping his coffee. There was no mere curiosity in his eyes. It was the gaze of a hunter, waiting for the right moment. Loretta instinctively felt this man knew something important about Ron, and he was here for a reason. That same day, a letter appeared in the church. There was no return address on the envelope, and inside were just a few lines. "Think you can hide forever, Ron? The truth always comes out." Ron found the letter first. Loretta noticed how he read it, standing in the church doorway. His face froze. He slowly crumpled the paper, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Then he abruptly hid the letter in his pocket and looked around, as if checking to see if anyone had noticed his reaction. But Loretta saw. She didn't hear the words, but his expression told her everything. It was a message from the past, and it scared him. That evening, when he was about to leave, Evan Miller decided to ask the question that had been bothering him for a long time. "Pastor, can I ask you something?" Ron didn't like it when people asked questions. "Of course, Evan," he replied, but his voice was strained. "I found a mention in the archives that you were appointed without the standard committee review. That's strange, isn't it, since the church usually requires a recommendation?" Ron was silent for a long time. "Are you doubting me? I just want to understand." Ron smiled, but there was something dark in his eyes. Sometimes God opens doors for those who don't expect it. Evan felt that the pastor hadn't answered his question, and at that moment he realized the main thing. Ron Addison was not who he pretended to be. Loretta could no longer sit idly by. That night she took an old phone and called a friend from another state, a former priest who now worked in the archives department of a large church in Dallas. "I need to find someone," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. She gave the name. There was silence on the other end. "Are you sure?" "Yes." A few minutes later, her friend sent her a message. It contained 3 words. "Disappeared in 2010. Loretta froze. Now she had more than just suspicions. Now she had evidence. And if Ron found out that she was digging into his past, he would do everything to stop her. Loretta couldn't sleep. She read the message over and over. Disappeared in 2010. Her fingers trembled, her heart pounded. She didn't know what exactly had happened that year, but now it was clear. Ron Addison was running from something. But from what? From whom? She looked out the window of her house and felt something pressing on her chest. In small towns, the truth rarely stays hidden. People always find a way to reveal it, and someone in Prairie View had already started doing just that. The next morning, Loretta stepped onto her porch and saw Evan Miller standing there. "We need to talk," he said quietly, looking around. She let him in, and he got straight to the point. "Last night, someone from another parish called me. They asked if Ron was really here." Loretta felt a chill run down her spine. "What did you tell them?" "I asked why they were interested. You know what they said?" He leaned closer. "This man disappeared many years ago." There was silence in the room. "Disappeared?" Loretta echoed. "Yes. He just left town one day, leaving only ruined lives behind." His voice sounded grim. "They didn't say what he did?" Evan shook his head. But judging by their voices, it was something terrible. Loretta felt a storm approaching, and she was right. That same day, another letter arrived at the church. Like the first, it had no return address, but this time the text was different. "I'm nearby. You know what to do." Loretta noticed how Ron paled as he read those words. He clutched the paper so tightly that its edges trembled. There was something new in his eyes. Fear, but not fear of God. Fear of a person. That night, Loretta decided to act. She waited for Ron to leave, then snuck into his office in the church. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt the answers were there. Rummaging through the drawers, she found an old worn envelope. She opened it. Inside were several yellow documents, stained with something that looked like old dried dirt or blood. On one of them was a name, Mary Ann Holloway. Loretta didn't know who this was, but her eyes caught the second line. Date of disappearance, September 7th, 2010. She gasped sharply. Dear God, this was not just a secret. This was a crime. Loretta knew she now had two choices: pretend nothing had happened and continue living, hoping the truth wouldn't surface. See the investigation through to the end, knowing it could put her life in danger. But when she looked at her trembling hands, when she remembered the expression on Ron's face as he read the letter, she realized she no longer had a choice. That very night she made her decision. She would uncover the truth, but she didn't know that she was already being watched. Loretta knew she could no longer remain silent. She met with Evan Miller in an alley behind the church, away from prying eyes. I found something. Her voice trembled, but she tried to speak confidently. Evan frowned. What is it? She handed him the documents. He quickly scanned the yellowed pages and looked up sharply. Damn it! Loretta took a deep breath. Evan, we need to go to the police. He slowly shook his head. We can't. Not now. Why not? Because if Ron finds out that we know, he'll do everything to stop us. The next morning, Loretta woke up with the feeling that she was being watched. When she stepped out of her house, Ron Addison was standing on her porch. He was smiling, but there was not a trace of kindness in that smile. Good morning, dear, he said softly. Loretta froze. What are you doing here? Ron stepped closer. I think we need to talk. She knew this conversation was inevitable, and it was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. They went inside. Ron sat at the table, clasping his fingers together. Loretta, you know that trust is the foundation of marriage? She said nothing. I feel like you don't trust me, he continued, tilting his head slightly. Is that true? Loretta swallowed. You're not who you claim to be. Ron slowly nodded, as if she had said what he expected to hear. So, you've been snooping through my things. His voice was calm, almost lazy, but there was something icy in it. Loretta began, but he interrupted her. You think you found the truth? He laughed. You can't even imagine what really happened. Loretta felt her breath catch. She took a step back. Ron stood up. You want to leave? She nodded. Then go. But her feet wouldn't move. She knew if she left now, he would find her, and then it would be too late. Evan was waiting by the car. When Loretta came out, he immediately knew something was wrong. He knows, she whispered, getting into the passenger seat. Evan started the engine. Then we don't have much time. They sped off toward the police station. But a few minutes later, Loretta felt her heart constrict with fear. In the rearview mirror, she saw a black SUV. It was following them, and she knew who was behind the wheel. Ron Addison. He had no intention of letting them go, and now a deadly chase began. Evan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Damn it, he's behind us. Loretta quickly turned around. The black SUV was bearing down on them with terrifying confidence. Its headlights blinded them in the mirror. He won't give up, Loretta whispered, trembling. No, Evan confirmed. He'll go all the way. The road ahead was empty. They had left the town limits, and now only the endless prairies stretched out around them, shrouded in night. The police station was 15 minutes away, but they didn't have 15 minutes. Ron was closing in. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash. Their car was violently jolted to the side. Ron was ramming them. Loretta screamed, grabbing the dashboard. Evan desperately tried to steady the car. Hold on! Another impact. Ron was trying to force them off the road. They raced down the winding highway between the hills. If they veered off course, they would plummet into the ditch. If Ron hit their car again, they would die. Evan gritted his teeth. We need to do something fast. Loretta frantically looked around. There, to the left. She pointed to a small side road. Turn there. Are you sure? Yes. Evan sharply turned the wheel. The car screeched, kicking up clouds of dust as they veered onto the narrow lane, hidden by dense foliage. Ron sped past, unable to stop in time. For a few seconds, there was silence. They held their breath, but it was too early to rejoice. Through the trees, headlights flashed. He had figured out where they were. Ron turned around, and now he was heading straight for them. Evan started the engine again, but it wouldn't start. No, no, no! He furiously turned the key. Loretta covered her mouth with her hand. Ron was approaching. Seconds ticked by, and then the engine roared to life. Evan hit the gas. They sped away. But now Ron knew where they were headed. They emerged back onto the main road. Ron was right on their tail. But ahead they saw salvation. A police roadblock. They could see the flashing lights of patrol cars. Ron saw it too. He knew he couldn't escape, but he wasn't going to give up. Instead, he accelerated. "What is he doing?" Loretta screamed. "He's going to ram us!" Evan floored the gas pedal, but Ron was faster. There was a deafening crash. Evan's car spun out of control, flipping through the air. Loretta screamed. Metal crunched around them. They crashed onto their side, skidding across the asphalt. Everything was shrouded in dust and smoke. Silence. And then, footsteps. Heavy, confident footsteps. Ron was approaching. Loretta struggled to lift her head. Her body ached with pain. She saw Ron standing by the wrecked car. In his hands was a gun. He looked down at her. "You ruined everything, Loretta." She couldn't move. Evan was unconscious. Ron aimed the weapon at her. "You shouldn't have meddled in my past." She closed her eyes, bracing for the shot. But it didn't come. There was a sharp cry. "Drop the weapon, Ron!" He turned around. Police officers surrounded him, guns drawn. Ron froze. He was cornered. There was nowhere left for him to run. The police moved in. Ron slowly raised his hands. He had lost. Ron was arrested on the spot. Loretta and Evan were taken to the hospital. A few days later, everyone learned the truth. About Ron's past. About his crimes. About how he tried to hide. But now his secrets were exposed. The court found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, he never repented. He just smiled. And Loretta would never forget that evening. She looked at the church where he once preached, and she thought about how close she had come to death. How easy it is to be mistaken about a person, and how important it is not to stay silent when you feel something is wrong.